My father demanded I surrender my newly purchased apartment to my golden child brother. When I refused, he cruelly threatened to erase me from his will forever. So, I handed him the legal documents that proved his favorite son's ultimate betrayal. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. My lungs burned with every breath I took. I had been fighting off a severe upper respiratory infection for the better part of 2 weeks, a direct result of pushing my body to the absolute breaking point. Between working grueling 80-hour weeks as a senior financial investigator, skipping meals, and meticulously packing up my old, dilapidated rental, my immune system had completely surrendered. But as I sat on the floor of my brand-new, half-empty living room, surrounded by towering cardboard boxes, the physical illness felt entirely secondary to the crushing weight in my chest. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in my life, I owned something that was entirely mine. A beautiful, sunlit apartment in the heart of the city. It was the culmination of a decade of relentless sacrifice. I had missed vacations, skipped social events, and hoarded every spare penny I earned. I had driven a car with a failing transmission for 5 years just to ensure my down payment would clear. This apartment wasn't just real estate to me, it was a physical manifestation of my independence and my worth. I had been staring blankly at a box labeled kitchen utensils when my phone began to buzz against the hardwood floor. The screen illuminated, displaying the name Dad. Thomas, my father. Despite my exhaustion, a small, foolish spark of hope flickered in my chest. He hadn't called me on the day I closed on the property. He hadn't called on moving day to see if I needed help, leaving my incredibly supportive fiancé, Luca, to carry the brunt of the heavy lifting. I thought, perhaps, he was finally calling to congratulate me, to tell me that he was proud of his daughter for achieving such a massive milestone completely on her own. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the rasp in my voice, and swiped to answer. "Hi, Dad." Kinsley, his voice boomed through the speaker. There was no warmth in it, no gentle inquiry about my health, even though he knew I had been sick. It was the sharp, authoritative tone he usually reserved for business transactions. "I need you to come over to the house tomorrow morning. Bring the deed and the title paperwork for that new place of yours." I blinked, my fever-addled brain struggling to process the abrupt demand. "The deed? Dad, what are you talking about? I just got the keys 2 days ago. The closing documents are still in a folder in one of these boxes. Why do you need to see them?" A heavy, irritated sigh crackled over the line. "I don't need to see them, Kinsley. I need you to bring them so we can go to the notary. You're going to transfer the property into Colton's name." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The silence that stretched between us was so absolute that I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock Luca had hung up that morning. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead, praying that the fever was causing me to hallucinate this conversation. "Transfer? To Colton?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "Dad, I bought this apartment. With my money, my life savings." "And you have a good job," Thomas snapped back, his impatience flaring. "You and Luca do just fine, but your brother is finally getting his life together. He's expanding his investment portfolio, and he needs a premium residence in the city to host his clients and establish his brand. He can't be living in the suburbs with me forever. It's embarrassing for a man of his stature." "His stature?" I choked out, a bitter, disbelieving laugh escaping my lips. "Dad, Colton is 30 years old and he hasn't held a steady job since he was 22. I worked for 10 years for this." "Don't you dare speak about your brother that way." Thomas roared, the sudden volume making me flinch and pull the phone away from my ear. "Colton is an entrepreneur. He takes risks. Risks that someone like you, pushing papers and crunching numbers all day, could never understand. He deserves a break, Kinsley. He deserves a place that matches his potential. You are going to sign that apartment over to him, and we will consider it your contribution to the family's legacy." My throat tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. The sheer audacity, the blatant, unapologetic favoritism, It wasn't just unfair, it was violently cruel. He wasn't asking for a loan. He was demanding that I hand over my entire life's work to a brother who had never worked a day in his life. No, I whispered, the words scraping against my raw throat. Excuse me. Thomas's voice dropped to a dangerous, icy register. I said no, Dad. I am not giving Colton my home. Never. If you choose to be this selfish, Thomas said slowly, enunciating every syllable like a judge delivering a sentence. If you choose to turn your back on your own flesh and blood when he needs you most, then you are no daughter of mine. You either sign that deed over tomorrow, or I will wipe your name from my will, my estate, and my life. You will be completely disinherited. Think very carefully about your next words, Kinsley. He didn't wait for my answer. The line went dead with a sharp click. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap, the glowing screen fading to black. The physical ache in my bones was nothing compared to the deep, hollow chasm that had just opened in my chest. The betrayal was far more crippling than the fever burning through my veins. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat on the cold hardwood floor, the afternoon sun casting long, mocking shadows across the empty room. My breathing was shallow and ragged, each inhale catching on the sharp edge of my father's words. Wipe your name from my life. He had said it so easily, so casually, as if 34 years of being his dutiful, responsible daughter meant absolutely nothing the moment I refused to be a stepping stone for his golden boy. The front door clicked open, and Luca walked in, balancing a tray with 2 steaming mugs of tea and a small plate of toast. He took one look at me, at my pale, tear-streaked face and the defeated slump of my shoulders, and immediately set the tray down on a nearby stack of boxes. Kinsley, honey, what's wrong? Is it your chest again? Do we need to go to urgent care? He was kneeling beside me in an instant, his warm, steady hands framing my face. His dark eyes were wide with genuine panic. I shook my head slowly, leaning into his touch. It was my dad, I managed to say, my voice sounding incredibly fragile in the cavernous space. Over the next 20 minutes, between sips of peppermint tea and sudden bouts of coughing, I relayed every agonizing word of the phone call to Luca. I watched his expression shift from deep concern to profound confusion, and finally to a quiet, simmering outrage. Luca was a data analyst, a man of logic and reason. To him, Thomas's demand wasn't just cruel, it was statistically and fundamentally absurd. He wants you to just give away a $500,000 asset. Luca asked, running a hand through his hair in disbelief. To Colton, the guy who tried to pitch me a cryptocurrency built entirely around pictures of exotic birds at Thanksgiving. He says Colton needs it for his brand, I muttered bitterly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug to stop them from shaking. And if I don't give it to him, Dad is cutting me out of the will entirely. He's disinheriting me. Luca's jaw tightened. Kinsley, your dad's estate is substantial, yes, but no amount of inheritance is worth letting them extort you out of your own home. We don't need his money. We never have. That's not the point, Luca, I whispered, a fresh wave of tears stinging my eyes. It's not about the money. It's about the fact that I have spent my entire life trying to earn his respect, trying to be the good daughter. And in one breath, he proved that I am completely disposable. The only child that matters is Colton. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and bathed the apartment in twilight, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't a call this time. It was a text message from Thomas. I expect to see you at 10 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Josephine will be here as well to help facilitate the family trust updates if you decide to make the wrong choice. Do not disappoint me, Kinsley. Family comes first. I stared at the glowing text. Aunt Josephine, Thomas's older sister. She was a highly successful real estate agent and the unofficial matriarch of our extended family. By inviting her, Thomas was escalating the situation. He was bringing in an audience to pressure me, to make my refusal seem like a public betrayal of the family values. He was going to use her to shame me into submission. I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. The fever had finally broken, leaving behind a chilling, crystal-clear lucidity. The tears had stopped. The sorrow was rapidly evaporating, boiling away to leave a cold, hardened resolve in its wake. My father and my brother thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they could use my lifelong desperation for Thomas's approval as leverage to rob me blind. They assumed I would fold under the threat of disinheritance because I had always folded in the past. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I was a senior financial investigator. My entire career was built on dismantling lies, tracking hidden assets, and exposing frauds who thought they were smarter than everyone else. And they had no idea that I already possessed a piece of knowledge that could destroy their entire narrative. To understand the depth of my father's delusion, you had to understand the history of our family dynamic. Since childhood, the rules in our household were clearly defined, though never spoken aloud. I was the workhorse. Colton was the show pony. When I was 22, freshly graduated with a heavy burden of student loans, Thomas was hospitalized with a severe heart condition. His insurance didn't cover the entirety of his bypass surgery or his subsequent rehabilitation. Without hesitation, I drained my meager savings account and took on a second job working nights at a hotel front desk to pay his medical debts. I spent my 20s agonizing over spreadsheets, eating instant noodles, and sacrificing any semblance of a social life to ensure my father didn't lose his home to medical bankruptcy. Colton, meanwhile, was 20 at the time. He contributed nothing. Instead, while I was working double shifts, he convinced Thomas to co-sign a loan for a semester abroad in Europe, claiming he needed to find his entrepreneurial spirit in the cafes of Paris and Rome. Over the next decade, this pattern only intensified. I fixed the leaky roof on Thomas's house. I negotiated his utility bills. I was the reliable, invisible scaffolding that kept my father's life intact. Colton was the glittering facade. Colton's career was a constantly rotating carousel of buzzwords and empty promises. He was a lifestyle influencer, a crypto visionary, and an angel investor, though he never seemed to actually invest any money. He was 30 years old and still living in the fully furnished basement suite of our father's suburban home. Yet, he drove a leased luxury sedan and wore bespoke suits he couldn't possibly afford. The memory of our last family dinner, just a month prior, played vividly in my mind. It was a celebration for my Aunt Josephine's 65th birthday. Colton had arrived 40 minutes late, making a grand entrance. He swept into the dining room smelling of expensive cologne, flashing perfectly veneered teeth. "Sorry I'm late, folks," Colton had announced, adjusting his designer cufflinks with practiced nonchalance. "Had a marathon conference call with some developers in Dubai. You know how it is. The market never sleeps." Thomas had practically glowed with pride, immediately standing up to pull out a chair for him. "My boy, working too hard as always. You need to remember to take care of yourself, Colton. Wealth is nothing without health." I had sat quietly at the end of the table, cutting my chicken, acutely aware that Thomas hadn't asked me a single question about the massive fraud case my firm had just successfully closed. Later that evening, as we were having coffee in the living room, Colton had sauntered over to me, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. He leaned against the mantel, swirling his espresso. "So, Kinsley," Colton had drawled, loud enough for Thomas and Josephine to hear. "Dad tells me you're finally closing on that little starter apartment downtown. Good for you. It's nice you're finally getting out of the rental trap, even if it is just a modest place." "It's a 3-bedroom penthouse layout, Colton," I had replied evenly, refusing to let him diminish my accomplishment. "It's hardly a starter apartment." Colton's eyes had gleamed with a predatory, calculating light. He looked me up and down, a subtle sneer forming. 3 bedrooms, for just you and the data cruncher. Seems like a massive waste of space, honestly. You should be careful, Kinsley. Over-leveraging yourself on real estate is a rookie mistake. You should have given me that capital to invest in my new tech startup. I could have doubled your money in 6 months. "I prefer tangible assets," I had shot back coldly. "Right, boring, safe, and predictable," Colton had laughed, glancing over at Thomas for validation. "Just like our Kinsley, always playing it so safe she misses the real opportunities." Thomas had chuckled warmly at Colton's insult, nodding in agreement. Your brother has a mind for high-level finance, Kinsley. You could learn a thing or two from him about generating real wealth. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of that conversation echoed in my mind now as I sat in the darkness of my new apartment. A mind for high-level finance. I stood up, my legs finally feeling sturdy beneath me. I walked over to the corner of the room where I had stacked my most important work boxes. I bypassed the kitchen supplies and the books. I knelt in front of a heavy, reinforced plastic storage bin secured with a combination padlock. I spun the dials, the mechanical clicks loud in the quiet room. 2 years ago, Thomas had asked me to help him set up a new retirement management software. He had handed me a box of disorganized bank statements and tax returns, complaining that the numbers were confusing him. I had spent a weekend sorting through his messy paperwork, but I am a forensic accountant. I don't just look at numbers, I look at the spaces between them. I look at behavioral patterns, hidden routing numbers, and the subtle inconsistencies that people think no one will ever notice. During that weekend, I had found an irregularity. A massive, glaring irregularity hidden deep within Thomas's secondary savings accounts and the equity line of credit on his house. I opened the lid of the heavy bin and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I ran my hand over the smooth cover. I hadn't said anything at the time. I had kept the secret buried, hoping against hope that I was wrong, or that the situation would resolve itself without tearing our family apart. I had wanted to protect my father's heart, but tonight, my father had made his choice. He had drawn the battle lines, weaponizing his love and his legacy against me. "You want to talk about family legacy, Dad?" I whispered to the empty room, opening the portfolio to reveal the stack of carefully cataloged, damning documents inside. "Let's talk about it." "Luca," I called out, my voice raspy but entirely steady. The feverish fog that had clouded my mind all afternoon had completely vanished, replaced by the icy, razor-sharp focus that had made me one of the top forensic accountants in my firm. "I need you to find the coffee maker in those boxes. Make the strongest pot of dark roast we have. We are going to be up all night." Luca appeared in the doorway, taking in the sight of me sitting cross-legged on the floor with the heavy leather portfolio open in my lap. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, his expression hardening with quiet solidarity, and turned toward the kitchen. I booted up my encrypted work laptop, the blue light washing over the dark hardwood floor. 2 years ago, when I had briefly untangled my father's messy retirement accounts, I had noticed a series of bizarre, erratic wire transfers originating from his secondary savings account. At the time, they were small amounts, 2,000 here, 3,000 there, always routed to a limited liability company I had never heard of. When I had gently asked Thomas about them, he had aggressively shut me down, claiming it was a private investment Colton was managing for him. Because I had no legal authority to dig deeper, and because I was terrified of causing a rift, I had backed off. I had saved the account numbers and routing data in this portfolio, locking it away. But tonight, Thomas had shattered the fragile peace of our family. He had threatened to take away my home and my inheritance to feed Colton's endless greed. I no longer had any reason to protect my father's illusions. I had every reason to protect myself. With Luca placing a steaming mug of black coffee beside me, I began to do what I do best. I followed the money. Using the LLC name from 2 years ago, I accessed public corporate registry databases. It took me less than 40 minutes to pull the foundational documents for Colton's so-called tech startup. As I suspected, Colton was listed as the sole proprietor, but what I found next made the breath catch in my throat. "Look at this," I murmured, pointing to the screen as Luca knelt beside me. "This isn't just a failed business. It's a black hole. He has 4 active judgments against him in civil court." Luca squinted at the dense legal text. "Judgments for what?" "Fraud," I said, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "Breach of contract, wire fraud. These aren't elite investors from Dubai. These are small-time suppliers and independent contractors he scammed out of their life savings to fund his lifestyle. But that's not even the worst part." I opened a new tab and logged into a specialized property records database, a tool I use daily to track hidden assets for corporate embezzlement cases. I typed in my father's home address, the sprawling, paid-off suburban house Thomas had lived in for 30 years. I hit enter. The screen populated with the property's financial history. "Oh my God," Luca whispered, his hand instinctively gripping my shoulder. There, glowing in stark black and white, was a massive, six-figure encumbrance against the property. Someone had taken out a maximum capacity home equity line of credit against Thomas's house just 8 months ago. And the mailing address for the loan statements wasn't my father's house. It was a private P.O. box registered 3 towns over. "My dad doesn't believe in debt," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and vindication. "He paid off his mortgage 15 years ago. He brags about it at every family gathering. He would never, ever take out a loan against his house." "Then how did Colton get the bank to approve it?" Luca asked. I clicked on the digital copy of the lien's public filing, scrolling down to the signature page. I zoomed in on the notary stamp and the scrawled signature of Thomas Baker. I had seen my father's handwriting every day of my childhood. I knew the sharp, aggressive angle of his T and the looped, lazy S at the end of his name. The signature on the screen was a decent imitation, but to a trained investigator, it was a glaring, undeniable forgery. "He stole it," I said, the reality of my brother's depravity finally sinking in. "Colton didn't just drain Dad's cash. He forged a power of attorney to leverage the house. He stole our father's identity to pay off his fraudulent startup debts, and now the money is gone. He's demanding my apartment because the bank is going to foreclose on Dad's house." I spent the next 6 hours compiling every public record, court docket, and property lien into a comprehensive, irrefutable dossier. By the time the sun began to rise over the city skyline, painting my new apartment in shades of gold and pink, I was no longer the heartbroken, sick daughter who had cried on the floor. I was a professional auditor, and I was armed to the teeth. The drive to the suburbs was silent. Luca kept one hand firmly on the steering wheel and the other intertwined with mine. The persistent cough from my respiratory infection rattled my chest occasionally, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins completely masked the fatigue. I clutched the thick, manila folder in my lap like a shield. When we pulled into Thomas's driveway at exactly 9:55 a.m., I noticed Aunt Josephine's pristine silver Lexus was already parked near the front door. "Are you ready for this, Kinsley Baker?" Luca asked softly, putting the car in park. "I've been ready for 10 years, I replied, unbuckling my seatbelt. We walked up the manicured front path and I pushed the front door open without knocking. The atmosphere inside the living room was thick with a heavy, performative solemnity. Thomas was seated in his favorite leather recliner, looking every bit the stern, disappointed patriarch. Aunt Josephine sat rigidly on the floral sofa, her hands folded over her designer purse, wearing an expression of deep disapproval. And then there was Colton. He was leaning casually against the stone fireplace mantel, dressed in a crisp, tailored linen shirt, sipping a green protein shake. When he saw me walk in, a painfully smug, victorious smirk spread across his face. He thought he had won. He truly believed I was here to surrender my life's work to him. "You're late," Thomas snapped, not bothering to offer a greeting. He didn't look at Luca. His eyes were fixed entirely on me. "Josephine has another appointment at noon, so let's make this quick. Put the deed and the transfer paperwork on the coffee table, Kinsley." I walked slowly into the center of the room, my sensible black flats sinking into the plush carpet. I didn't reach into my bag. I just stood there, looking down at my father. "I didn't bring the deed, Dad," I said, my voice calm, projecting perfectly through the quiet room. "I am not transferring my apartment to Colton. Not today, not ever." Josephine gasped softly, a theatrical display of shock. "Kinsley, your father told me you were being stubborn, but to disrespect him in his own home like this. After everything he's provided for you." "Disrespect?" Thomas roared, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand against the armrest of his chair and pushed himself up to his feet. "You arrogant, ungrateful girl. I warned you last night. If you refuse to help your brother establish his future, you have no future in this family. I have my estate attorney on speed dial. I will cut you out of the will this very minute." "Dad, calm down," Colton intervened, using a silky, patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. He took a step forward, holding his hands up as if to play the peacemaker. "Let's not be too hard on her. Kinsley just doesn't understand high-level investments. She's scared to lose her little safety net. It's a peasant mindset, really. She can't help it." I turned my gaze to my brother. The sheer audacity of his condescension was almost comical given what I held in my hands. "You're right, Colton," I said smoothly, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "I don't understand high-level investments. I prefer boring, predictable numbers, like the numbers on Dad's mortgage." I turned back to Thomas. "Dad, before you call your attorney to disinherit me, I have a very simple financial question for you. What is the current balance of the home equity line of credit on this house?" Thomas stopped mid-rant, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What kind of nonsense question is that? I don't have a line of credit. I paid this house off in full 15 years ago. You know that perfectly well." "I do know that," I replied. I slowly unclasped the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the bank printout I had pulled at 3:00 a.m. I stepped forward and placed it gently onto the glass coffee table between us. "So, you might want to look at this." Thomas scoffed, but his eyes darted down to the paper. He picked it up, adjusting his reading glasses. The room fell entirely silent. I watched his eyes scan the document. I watched the angry red flush drain from his cheeks, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. What is this?" Thomas stammered, his hands beginning to shake. "This says there is a $150,000 lien on my property. This is a mistake. The bank made a mistake." "Let me see that," Josephine demanded, snatching the paper from Thomas's trembling hands. Her eyes widened as she read the bold, undeniable figures. "Thomas, this was drawn 8 months ago. The interest alone is staggering." I looked over at Colton. The smug smirk had completely vanished from his face. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. The green protein shake in his hand was visibly trembling. "It's a bank routing error," Colton blurted out, his voice a pitch higher than normal. It was an incredibly sloppy, desperate lie. "Dad, don't listen to her. My wealth manager told me about this glitch last week. Their automated system accidentally attached one of my corporate development loans to your address. My team is already handling it. It'll be cleared by Friday." "A routing error?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's fascinating, Colton, because automated bank glitches don't usually require a notarized signature." "Shut up, Kinsley," Colton shouted, taking an aggressive, threatening step toward me. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're just a jealous, bitter spinster trying to ruin my relationship with Dad because you know he loves me more." Luca immediately stepped in front of me, his broad shoulders squaring off against my brother. "Take one more step toward her, Colton, and we'll see how well your wealth manager handles dental reconstructive surgery." Colton froze, his eyes darting nervously between Luca's imposing frame and the folder in my hands. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his polished composure, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his panic. Thomas, however, was still desperately trying to cling to the illusion he had nurtured for 30 years. He couldn't accept that his golden child was flawed, let alone a criminal. "Kinsley, you had no right to go digging into family finances." Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with defensive desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Colton said it was a mistake. These high-level banking systems have glitches all the time. Your brother is an entrepreneur dealing with millions of dollars in capital. Things get crossed. You're maliciously twisting a clerical error to make him look bad because you don't want to share your apartment." Aunt Josephine, to her credit, was looking at Colton with newfound, intense suspicion. "Thomas, $150,000 is not a clerical error, and Kinsley is a certified financial auditor. If she says there's a problem, we need to listen." "No, we don't." Thomas stubbornly insisted, blindly defending the son who was actively destroying him. She's always been jealous of his ambition. She's hacking into systems to fabricate drama. The profound tragedy of my father's denial hit me like a physical blow. He was so terrified of admitting he was wrong about his son that he was willing to go down with the sinking ship. But I refused to let him drag me down with him. The time for gentle hints had passed. It was time to systematically dismantle every lie Colton had ever told. I didn't hack anything, Dad. Everything I found is a matter of public legal record, I said, my voice hardening into an authoritative, clinical tone. I pulled out a thicker stack of documents from the folder. Colton isn't an entrepreneur dealing with millions. His so-called tech startup has generated exactly $0 in revenue in 3 years, but it has generated plenty of lawsuits. I dropped the stack of court dockets onto the coffee table. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. What lawsuits? Josephine asked, leaning forward, her eyes darting across the pages. 3 separate civil suits for wire fraud and breach of contract, I explained, maintaining direct eye contact with my father, forcing him to look at the truth. The developers in Dubai Colton brags about, they don't exist. The plaintiffs suing him are 2 independent contractors from New Jersey and a small-time investor from Ohio. Colton took their money, promised them equity in a fake software platform, and used their funds to lease his luxury car and buy his designer clothes. And when those people finally sued him to get their money back, his accounts were frozen. Lies. Colton screamed, his polished veneer shattering entirely. He lunged toward the coffee table, trying to grab the court documents. Dad, she fabricated all of this. She printed fake papers from the internet. Don't look at them. Luca easily intercepted Colton, shoving him back toward the fireplace. Don't touch the papers, Colton. Thomas stared at the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. Colton, what is she talking about? Is this true? Of course it's not true. Colton pleaded, his eyes wide and manic as he looked at Thomas. She's insane, Dad. She's trying to frame me so she can keep all her money to herself. You know me. I'm your son. I'm building a legacy for us. You're building a prison sentence, I corrected him coldly. I pulled out the final, most damning piece of paper from my folder. Because when your accounts were frozen, Colton, you needed cash fast. You couldn't afford to pay your legal fees, and you definitely couldn't afford to keep up the charade of being a wealthy investor. So, you went to a predatory lender. I held up a copy of the loan origination document. The bank didn't make a routing error, Dad, I said softly, the sorrow finally bleeding into my voice. The loan statements for the house aren't even being sent here. Colton had them redirected to a private P.O. box 3 towns away so you would never see the late notices. The lender is preparing to foreclose on this house in 60 days because Colton hasn't made a single payment. Thomas clutched his chest, sinking back into his recliner as if his legs had given out. But they would need my permission. They would need my signature to borrow against my home. They did have your signature, I said, delivering the final, crushing blow. I slid the magnified, side-by-side signature analysis across the glass table. He forged a power of attorney, Dad. He went to a shady notary, faked your signature, and signed away the house you worked your entire life to pay off. He didn't just borrow money. He stole your identity. He stole your retirement. And he demanded my apartment today because he knows he's about to be homeless, and he wanted to drag me down with him. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute, thick, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that only occurs when an entire worldview is fundamentally shattered. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood, echoing through the tense, motionless living room. Thomas sat frozen in his leather recliner, his eyes locked on the magnified, side-by-side images of the forged signature. His chest rose and fell in jagged, shallow gasps. The proud, unyielding patriarch who had threatened to erase me from his life just a day ago was gone. In his place was an aging, terrified man watching the walls of his reality collapse inward. Aunt Josephine was the first to break the stillness. She leaned over the glass coffee table, her reading glasses perched precariously on the bridge of her nose. She traced the lines of the ink on the paper with a trembling, manicured fingernail. "Thomas," Josephine whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust. "Thomas, look at the loop on the s. You never loop your s like that. And the pressure on the pen, it's too light. It's a copy, a tracing. Kinsley is right. This is not your handwriting." Colton let out a high-pitched, frantic laugh that bordered on a sob. The polished, arrogant entrepreneur facade had completely melted away, leaving behind a panicked, cornered child. "Aunt Jo, don't listen to her," Colton pleaded, his hands waving erratically in the air. "She's a forensic accountant. She creates fake documents for a living. She probably forged that herself to frame me, because she's a jealous, bitter, glorified calculator who can't stand that Dad loves me more." "I uncover fake documents for a living, Colton," I corrected him calmly, my voice steady and devoid of any sympathy. "I don't create them, and I certainly didn't create the notary stamp at the bottom of that page. A notary whose license was suspended 3 months ago for fraudulent filings, by the way. A fact I verified through the state registry at 4 o'clock this morning." Colton lunged forward again, his face twisted in an ugly, desperate snarl. "Give me those papers. You have no right to bring this garbage into this house." Luca didn't just step in front of me this time. He grabbed Colton by the lapels of his expensive, custom-tailored linen shirt and shoved him backward with such force that Colton stumbled and fell hard onto the plush carpet. "Stay down," Luca commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If you try to touch her or those documents one more time, I am going to call the police and have you arrested for assault before the fraud charges even have a chance to stick." "Dad, are you going to let him do this to me?" Colton cried out from the floor, scrambling backward like a frightened crab. He looked up at Thomas with wide, pleading eyes, deploying the same manipulative, victimized tone he had used to get his way since we were children. "Dad, tell them to leave. Tell them to get out of our house. You said you were going to disinherit her. Do it right now." But Thomas didn't look at me. He didn't look at the phone to call his attorney. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head and looked down at the son he had worshipped for 30 years. I watched the exact moment the veil finally lifted from my father's eyes. I watched the decades of willful ignorance, the endless excuses, and the blind, unearned pride dissolve into a crushing, agonizing clarity. He looked at Colton's designer clothes, paid for with stolen money. He thought about the medical bills I had paid when I was 22, working night shifts while Colton partied in Europe. He thought about the home he had built, now mortgaged to the hilt by the boy sitting on the floor. Thomas slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He seemed to have aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. His shoulders were slumped, but his jaw was set with a new, devastating resolve. "Dad," Colton squeaked, his voice cracking. "Tell them." "How much?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. Colton blinked, feigning confusion. "What? Dad, I told you, it's a glitch." "How much did you steal from me, Colton?" Thomas roared, the sound tearing from his throat with such ferocious volume that the glass light fixtures above us actually rattled. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. "I gave you everything. I paid for your cars, your clothes, your food. I let you live under my roof. I offered you every advantage, every opportunity, and you stole my home. You forged my name like a common thief. I was going to pay it back." Colton sobbed, finally breaking under the weight of the undeniable evidence. He curled his knees to his chest, the picture of pathetic entitlement. "The business was going to take off, Dad. I just needed a little more capital to hold off the other investors. If Kinsley had just given me her apartment like a good sister, I could have sold it and paid the bank, and you never would have known. This is her fault. She's ruining everything." The sheer, breathtaking narcissism of his statement hung in the air. He wasn't sorry he had stolen our father's home. He was angry that I hadn't let him steal mine to cover it up. Thomas closed his eyes, a single, heavy tear escaping and rolling down his weathered cheek. He took a deep, shuddering breath, steadying himself. When he opened his eyes again, the father who had bobbied Colton was completely gone. "Get up," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy calm. Colton scrambled to his feet, sniffling loudly. Dad, please, we can fix this. We can talk to the bank. Give me the keys to the sedan, Thomas demanded, holding out his hand. The lease is in my name. Give me the keys right now. Colton's eyes widened in sheer panic. Dad, how am I supposed to get to my meetings? You have no meetings, Thomas stated, his tone flat and unyielding. You have no business. You have a criminal record waiting to happen. Give me the keys, Colton, or I will call the police and report the vehicle stolen. Trembling violently, Colton reached into his pocket and placed the heavy key fob into our father's outstretched palm. Now, Thomas continued, pointing a shaking finger toward the front door. I want you to walk out that door. You will not pack your bags. You will not go down to the basement. You will leave this property with exactly what you have in your pockets. You are going to go to the police station, and you are going to confess to what you have done. Dad, you can't be serious. Colton shrieked, tears streaming down his face. I'll go to jail. I'll be ruined. I'm your son. No, Thomas said, his voice breaking with a final, devastating finality. I had a daughter who loved me enough to sacrifice her own youth to save my life, and I threatened to disinherit her to protect a parasite. You are no son of mine. Get out of my house, Colton, before I call the police myself. Colton looked at Josephine for help, but she turned her face away, her expression hardened with disgust. He looked at me, his eyes full of venom, but Luca took a deliberate step forward, crossing his arms. Realizing he was entirely out of options, Colton let out a pathetic, guttural cry, turned on his heel, and sprinted out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. The moment the front door clicked shut, the last of Thomas's adrenaline vanished. His knees buckled, and he collapsed back into his recliner, burying his face in his hands. Great, heaving sobs racked his chest. It was a terrible, agonizing sound, the sound of a proud man mourning the death of his greatest illusion and realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his own mistakes. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the triumphant thrill I thought I might. Instead, as I looked at my broken father, the deep, hollow chasm in my chest finally began to close, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. I walked over to the recliner and knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his trembling knee. Thomas flinched, pulling his hands away from his tear-streaked face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an unbearable, suffocating shame. Kinsley, he choked out, his voice barely audible. My God, Kinsley, what have I done? How could I have been so blind? You tried to tell me. You tried to warn me 2 years ago, and I shut you out. I threatened to take your home, the home you worked so beautifully for. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve you. Dad, breathe, I said softly, my own vision blurring with tears. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly seen by him. He wasn't looking past me to find Colton. He was looking directly at me. He stole everything, Thomas wept, staring at the foreclosure notice on the table. I'm going to lose the house. I'm going to lose everything I worked for. No, you aren't, I said, my voice firm, snapping back into my professional demeanor. I squeezed his knee to ground him. You are not going to lose this house, Dad. You are a victim of identity theft and wire fraud. The bank cannot legally foreclose on a property based on a fraudulent lien, especially with an invalid notary. Thomas blinked, a tiny, desperate glimmer of hope sparking in his wet eyes. But the money is gone. How do we prove it? I already have the proof, I told him, tapping the thick manila folder. I have my firm's senior legal counsel on speed dial. He specializes in white-collar fraud and predatory lending defense. We are going to file a police report against Colton for identity theft today. We are going to submit this entire dossier to the state attorney general and the bank's fraud department. It will be a long, bureaucratic nightmare, Dad, but they will not take this house. I won't let them. Aunt Josephine walked over, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and placed a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder. She's right, Thomas. You aren't alone in this. We are going to fix it. And I am going to make sure the rest of the family knows exactly what Kinsley did for you today. They need to know the truth. The next 6 months were a grueling, exhausting whirlwind of legal battles, depositions, and courtroom appearances. I used every resource, every contact, and every ounce of my professional expertise to build an impenetrable defense for my father. Colton's downfall was swift, brutal, and entirely public. When we filed the police report for the forged home equity line of credit, it triggered a massive, cascading investigation. The plaintiffs from Ohio and New Jersey caught wind of the criminal charges and immediately filed emergency injunctions. Colton was arrested just 2 weeks later, picked up by authorities while trying to quietly pawn the designer watch he had bought with my father's stolen equity. Without Thomas to pay for high-priced defense attorneys, Colton was assigned a public defender. He tried to plea bargain, but the paper trail I had meticulously uncovered was too damning. He was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, permanently ruining his reputation, his credit, and his fabricated entrepreneurial legacy. Aunt Josephine made sure the extended family knew the exact details of his crimes, ensuring he would never manipulate another relative again. As for my father's house, it took months of aggressive litigation, but my firm's attorney successfully forced the bank to invalidate the fraudulent lien. The foreclosure was canceled. The house remained safely in Thomas's name. The healing process between my father and me was slow, but it was genuine. Stripped of his golden child, Thomas was forced to reevaluate everything. He started attending therapy to unpack his deep-seated favoritism and his obsession with appearances. On a warm Friday evening in late spring, the doorbell to my downtown apartment rang. I walked through my beautifully decorated, fully unpacked living room, the late afternoon sun catching the vibrant leaves of the potted plants Luca had bought me. I opened the door to find Thomas standing in the hallway. He looked older, tired, but there was a genuine, warm light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. In his hands, he held a beautiful, antique wooden wall clock. "Dad," I smiled, stepping aside to let him in. "You made it." "I wouldn't miss it, sweetheart," he said softly, walking into the sunlit space. He looked around, genuine awe on his face. "Kinsley, this place is magnificent. You did an incredible job." "Thank you, Dad," I replied, feeling a deep, abiding peace settle over my heart. He handed me the antique clock, his hands remarkably steady. "I know I'm a little late for a housewarming gift, but I saw this and I thought of you, because you always knew the true value of time and hard work. I am so incredibly proud of you, Kinsley. I always should have been." I took the clock, tears of profound vindication and relief pricking my eyes. The battle was over. The truth had won, and for the first time in my life, I was finally home.